Let's get joined up. Today's show is brought to you by Audible, and right now you can get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/joinedup. There's over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. So thanks for tuning in to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, a regular show about all things writing, including interviews with authors, screenwriters, and key figures from the publishing industry. Plus loads of hints, tips, and inspiration for all creatives. You can follow us on Twitter at JU Podcast, leave a quick iTunes review, or just tell a friend.
Joined Up Writing.
Yes, hello and welcome to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, where a little procrastination can go a long way. I'm Wayne Kelly and it's episode 153 with New York Times bestselling author Maggie Shipstead. Maggie talks to me about writing her epic third novel, Great Circle, as well as telling me about her journey into writing and why you need to leave your ego at the door. Before that, a swift catch-up from me. Firstly, apologies for the lack of episodes in the past few weeks. My day job's been pretty full on as lockdown measures continue to ease and the corporate world stirs from its uneasy sleep. Oh, and whilst that's a pretty good excuse for not putting out new podcasts, it doesn't really explain why I haven't done any fiction writing for weeks. It's something off-air, actually, I was chatting to an upcoming guest about, and the fact that I'm concerned that these intros are becoming very repetitive and a little depressing as I continually confess to my woeful word count. But she made the point that it was refreshing to hear some honesty, and maybe many of you out there are feeling the same, and maybe you take some comfort from the fact that we all struggle at one time or another. And whilst that's a valid point, I do realise it's not the height of entertainment or inspiration to listen to me whining on about it every week. And one of the nice side effects of putting out regular shows is that I'm aware I'll be back here next week and I'll have to give you some kind of update on my progress, which in a strange way makes me feel accountable to you all and drives me to actually attempt to write something. And so with that in mind, I have regular episodes scheduled for the next few weeks, which means I've got nowhere to hide. I've got that extra motivation to be productive before I record the next introduction. So I won't labour the point too much this week. Suffice to say, I haven't written a single new word of fiction or worked on my novel for several weeks, but I have written another couple of songs which will be on the upcoming Wry Dogs album. As I've said before, I'm currently finding songs much easier to write. They're quick, they're immediate, and a lot of the heavy lifting is being done by the music. And because George and I record them pretty rapidly too, it means I don't have time to be precious about them or worry if they need a rewrite or something. So for good or ill, they go out into the world via Spotify, Amazon, Apple or wherever, and they're a record of a moment in time. I mean, if only writing a novel was so easy, eh? What I will say is that I still think I'm sort of stuck in a psychological quicksand when it comes to my book, Safe Hands. I continue to flip-flop about the best course of action, and I must confess I've been inspired and influenced by kind words from some of you who've got in touch. But my gut is telling me that it might just be prudent to just park Safe Hands for a while. Just quietly lock it in a metaphorical drawer and think about something new. I think the best course of action in the short term is to try and write a new short story or two to kind of fall back in love with the process, remind myself of the thrill of creation and stretch out some of these tired writing muscles that have atrophied over the past year or so. There you go. I said I wasn't going to talk about it and go on and on about it, and yet still I did. Apologies. Anyway, it's almost time for me to shut up, but before we go to today's interview, I would like to remind you that I love to hear from listeners. It really does inspire me, so please get in touch, whether it's just to say hi, tell me what you're working on, what issues you're having, or what you'd like to hear more and less of in the show. That would be great. And you can do that by tweeting me at JU Podcast, emailing wayne@waynekellywrites.com, or dropping me a line on the FB page. Also, don't forget to join the email mailing list at joinedupwriting.co.uk. It's totally free and you get a couple of downloadable goodies when you sign up, and you'll be the first to find out about upcoming shows and events. Right, let's get to today's interview with Maggie Shipstead. So Maggie is the New York Times best-selling author of the novels Astonish Me and seating arrangements, which won the Dylan Thomas Prize and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for First Fiction. She's a graduate of Harvard and the Iowa Writers Workshop, a former Wallace Stegner Fellow at Stanford, and the recipient of a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts. Her new book, Great Circle, is out right now everywhere you can find good books. So enjoy the chat, and I'll pop back at the end for a sign-off.
Joined up writing.
Okay, Maggie, thanks a million for joining me on Joined Up Writing. Really appreciate it. So why don't you just give us a sense of where you're speaking from and how things are going for you at the moment?
I'm speaking from my house on the east side of Los Angeles. It's a beautiful spring day. It's exactly 1 week before my book is published. So, it's kind of a high anxiety time.
I was going to say exciting, but nerve-wracking, yeah.
Yeah, it's the worst, actually.
Well, it's you'll be glad to know, staying true to type here in the UK, it's grey and raining, which is nice. So it'd be a nice contrast to LA. But, so why don't you start off just telling us about your about that book that comes out in a week's time, and give us a sense of the premise and what it's called and everything.
Sure, yeah. So my new book is called Great Circle, and it's a novel. It's about a female pilot named Marion Graves who disappears in 1950 while trying to fly around the world north-south over the poles. But it starts much earlier. It starts before she's born, and I think the earliest section is 1909, and goes through her life. She grows up in Missoula, Montana in the 1920s and flies for a bootlegger. She flies in Alaska in the 30s, and then she comes over to the UK to fly for the Air Transport Auxiliary during World War II. And then interwoven with her story is that of a modern movie star named Hadley Baxter, who is playing Marion in a movie about her life and is kind of emerging from a scandal and hoping for redemption through this part, and also sort of looking to Marion's life for some guidance on what to do with her own, because she's quite lost, and she gets sort of sucked into the mystery of Marion's disappearance.
Well, it sounds like a great premise. So do you remember kind of what sparked the initial idea?
I do. It had, I think fairly unusually for a book, it had a really clear first spark. It was back in 2012, and I was waiting for edits on my second book, Astonish Me. My first book had been published a few months before, and I'd been traveling alone in New Zealand for maybe 3.5 weeks. Mm-hmm. And I had sort of a project going that I thought would be my third novel. But while I was traveling, I realized it was just sort of dying on me, like it wasn't going to go anywhere. So I was at the airport in Auckland feeling a little bit dejected and kind of wondering what I would do instead. And there's a statue there of Jean Batten. And I think the international terminal is named after her. She was the first person to fly solo from London to Auckland in the 30s. And there's a plaque engraved with a quote of hers, which said, "I was destined to be a wanderer." And I sort of thought, I should write a book about an aviatrix.
Yeah.
And I eventually, the first line of Great Circle became, "I was born to be a wanderer," sort of drawn from her. But it really wasn't, I didn't start working for another 2 years. So I just sort of had this idea in the back of my head to write about a pilot, but nothing more specific than that.
And it kind of grew from that, as these things do in the back of your mind.
Yeah, a bit. Although it was, I wrote a few sort of false starts in spring of 2014, and I was planning to set it in Nebraska, which, if for those who aren't super familiar with U.S. geography, is basically a cornfield that's like 600 miles long and very flat, empty state. And I thought that during a period while I was spending 2 months in Missoula, Montana, which is this beautiful mountain valley city, I was living on the side of a mountain, basically. And it wasn't until after I left Missoula that I thought, maybe I should set it in Missoula instead. And it was September of that year, 2014, that I settled in LA. And that's when I really started working.
Really knuckling down to it. So it sounds like it's really epic book in terms of both, it spans continents and decades, and obviously multiple perspectives, etc. So how challenging was it to write compared to your previous books? Was there a lot of research needed before you properly got started, or did you just kind of push on and fill in the blanks later? How did that pan out?
Yeah, it was an absolute nightmare to write. It was by far the most difficult thing I've done. And there were many sort of crises along the way of sort of, I don't know, worrying about technical decisions, coming to semi-dead ends, doubt, all these things. And I'm not really able to plan or outline before I write. And that's true even of my short stories. So I just kind of started. And I didn't do much research before I started. I had to make a couple decisions, like I figured out what route she would take around the world, north-south, which particularly in 1950 would have been challenging. And I figured out what kind of airplanes she would fly. But then once I started, just all these unexpected avenues of research popped up. Like I decided to start with a ship launch in Glasgow. And so I had to look up how that would work, And so as I went, I accumulated this sort of eccentric library of out of print and obscure books about just all sorts of different subjects, like ships and airplanes and natural history and Missoula and all the other places. I wrote about Alaska and World War II, this and that. And I just kind of come to something and start working. And then often through details I came across in my research, those would end up driving the plot. I'd think, oh, that's cool. And I'd put it in. Mm-hmm. And then, the story would make some huge left turn because of that. Like, for example, Marion has a twin brother who is an artist during World War II. And I think I just came across a documentary about these artists who were, recruited by the armed forces, by each service branch, and sort of sent out into battle to document them in different ways. And so then that became a part of the book.
Wow. So how do you, because obviously the great challenge with anything like that when you've got lots of research to do, especially if you're kind of bouncing off it and it's taking you into different places, is that the challenge is to not end up just procrastinating and researching and not writing. So how do you avoid that, or did you not?
I'm sure there were times I didn't. I think I don't love researching enough to really let it take up too much of my time. I kind of want to get in and get out, and I get impatient with it. So that really helps. But yeah, and it just, at times it was just completely overwhelming. Like I think, so the draft that I sold, which was like 2 years and 8 months ago, was 980 manuscript pages. It was almost 300,000 words.
Wow.
And it lost a quarter of that length in edits. So the printed book is just under 600 pages. But I think I got 2 years into writing the first draft. I'd written more than 400 pages, and it dawned on me that I wasn't halfway through. I could just tell. And that was sort of a dark day. It was just, how do you cope with not being overwhelmed? And the answer was just sort of embracing the fact that the only way out was through. And I just had to focus on what I could do in each day and not really think about the big picture. And yeah, it took me 3 years and 3 months to write the first draft.
Wow, and obviously it was a massive undertaking. And were there times during that, have you kind of got somebody that reads your work, or that you share little bits and pieces of like early drafts with, or was it very much something you just kind of had to suffer with yourself?
Yeah, I just had to suffer with it myself. I think I showed a very little bit to my agent early on, and she tends to kind of discourage me from doing that. And the experience is unrewarding enough that I don't do it anyway. She'll kind of read it and she'll say something like, well, this probably won't be in the finished book anyway. And I'm like, it won't? It's so good. So yeah, I think she is my first reader. So she read it after those 3 years and 3 months. And it took her kind of about a month to read it and gather her thoughts. And then we spoke on the phone, I think for like 2 hours one day, then 3 hours, then 2 hours. We spent hours over the course of a week with her just giving me notes. And then I spent, I think, 8 or 9 months revising from there. And then worked with my editor at Knopf, who I've had for all three of my books. But yeah, I don't really have readers along the way, partly for sake of efficiency. I think I just kind of need to do it. And then it can be hard to evaluate a novel in pieces. So I like to be able to show people the complete thing.
And are you okay with just pushing on and not doing any editing until you've got that first draft out? Because obviously some people are not keen on not editing as they go along. They kind of keep chipping away as they go and, work their way through it like that.
Yeah, I do quite a bit of sort of picking at it. Like I'll go back and read what I've written, and particularly just because of my schedule. Like during the time I was writing this novel, I also started writing for travel magazines and traveling more for myself. And the sort of research of the book and these travel assignments became this sort of symbiotic thing. And so there would be periods when I didn't write that might even be a couple months. And so I'd have to go back and read to figure out what I'd been doing or thinking. And so inevitably, you do little edits while doing that. And sometimes I'd make a pretty big change, and then I'd have to go back and change the earlier text to sort of accommodate it. But for the most part, I tried to just push forward.
And not worry about it too much as you can anyway.
Right.
So let's take a bit of a step back. So tell us a little bit about your background in general, where you grew up, and kind of, do you remember your earliest memory of writing, how you sort of came to writing?
I do, because I was in college. So I was 19, I guess. Yeah, I grew up in Southern California in Orange County, which is between Los Angeles and San Diego. And it was a nice place to grow up, particularly in the 80s and 90s. It kind of had this sunny, blinkered optimism about everything. And then I went away to Harvard, which is where I started writing, and kind of on a whim. I was a English and American literature major, and my sophomore year, I just sort of thought, maybe I'll apply for a fiction writing class. And so I took that. And then the following year, Zadie Smith was a visiting professor. And I don't think she'd ever taught creative writing before. Now she teaches full time, I think. And she was really young. She was 30. And she was incredibly harsh. Like, I think she was surprised by how bad, student writing was. She just hadn't been exposed to it. And when she was, 23, she was this sort of finished writer. So I think some people found that really demoralizing, but I found it pretty inspiring. It was like, yeah, this is truthful. This is bad. Like, that's just the way it is. And so you try to get better. So then for my senior thesis, instead of writing a research paper or a critical paper, I wrote a collection of short stories. And then the year after I graduated, when I was 21, I just stayed in Boston. I didn't really have any idea what to do with myself. I sort of worked at a law firm part-time. And then I applied to graduate program, or just one graduate program in writing. I applied to the Iowa Writers Workshop, and my assumption was that I wouldn't get in, and then the next year I'd do my research and apply to other programs. But I did get in. So then all of a sudden I had 2 years, where somebody was telling me where to go and what to do, and paying me to do it. And so that's when I really started to get serious, or when it started to seem like a more viable career, I suppose.
And can you remember along the way? Can you remember what sort of your first little writing success was? And that might not necessarily have been. It might have been a competition success, or it might have been publication of something or whatever. But equally, it could have just been a nice bit of feedback or something. Do you remember what that was and how you felt when you got it?
Yeah, I think it was my senior year when I was working on that collection of short stories, and my advisor, one of the stories, she said she thought it would be published, and that sort of took me by surprise. And then I ended up getting a summa cum laude on the thesis itself, and got comments. Jamaica Kincaid was one of my readers, and I got these sort of over the top positive comments from her, which I think in retrospect, might just be her way. Like, I don't think it actually means that much. But at the time, it gave me a big boost, not necessarily of confidence, but just of thinking, well, if she says this, then it wouldn't be so crazy to apply to Iowa, maybe, down the road. And so I think that was kind of one of my first, I think about them as green lights, like things that have just kind of opened up this path to me.
Yeah. And on that, do you, in terms of, you kind of mentioned briefly there your first novel, which that Seating Arrangements, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah.
So what was the path to publication with that first novel? How did that happen? Did you secure an agent first? How did that happen?
Sure. So Seating Arrangements started as a short story that I wrote at the end of my first year at Iowa. So I was 23. And the next year I revised it and brought it into workshop again. And my teacher said, I think maybe there's too much for a short story here. Maybe it could be a novella. And again, I think this is something that people sort of just say. But again, I took it really to heart. And so I just had it in the back of my mind that when I felt ready to write a novel, this is what I would do. And so that year, my second year at Iowa, was when I met my agent. And the program organizer just sent me to pick her up at the airport because she was coming to visit and give a talk and meet with students. And so the administrator called me and she was like, "Do you have a car?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Do you have an agent?" I said, "No." And she was like, "Okay, well, go get this woman at the airport." And we really just clicked. And it's really funny because she's the only agent I ever talked to. And it's basically like marrying the first person you go on a date with, immediately after that date.
But it worked out. Love at first sight.
Yeah. We've, worked together for 14 years now, I guess. So when I graduated from Iowa, I had a little bit of fellowship money. And so I decided I was going to expand the short story, and I knew I was setting it on a fictionalized Nantucket, which, for those who don't know, is sort of a fancy resort island off of Massachusetts. So I went there for 8 or 9 months through the winter, which the book is set in the summer when it's kind of bustling with, summer residents and tourists. And in the winter, nobody is there. It's like an abandoned island. So I was on this street of dark houses, sort of typing away with my dog. And I was really isolated. I think I went 5 weeks without having a face-to-face conversation with another person.
Wow.
But at the end of those 8 or 9 months, I had a first draft, which sent to my agent. This was my first experience having long critical phone calls with her. And after that, I had gotten a fellowship at Stanford for 2 years, which was in some ways similar to my MFA program. You'd go to workshop once a week with 9 other people. And so during that period, I was writing short stories, and I also was working on editing Seating Arrangements, and I sold it I think the summer between my 2 years there to my editor at Knopf. And then it was published 2 years later in, June of 2012.
That's great. And how did that feel? Do you remember how that felt when you kind of went along each step of the way?
It was exciting. And I think it's exciting until you get to each step, and then it's terrifying. Like, it occurs to you that no one will buy this book, and you've been writing it in vain, which is entirely possible. And it was kind of actually selling it was a little bit of a weird experience because one of my short stories had been at that point in the Best American Short Stories, and a pretty famous book editor came across it and got in touch with Rebecca, my agent, and asked if I had a novel, and we're all excited. And so we sent it to her on like a week's exclusive. So only she saw it for a week.
Yeah.
And at the end of that week, we still hadn't heard from her. So Rebecca sent it to a few more editors. And then I think it was like day 8, the famous editor got back to us and she was like, I'd like to buy Maggie's next novel, like a book I hadn't started or even conceived of, like on the condition that we take seating arrangements and like put it in a drawer and just never speak of it again.
Really?
Yeah, so that was just like extremely unnerving. But it was the very same day my editor at Knopf, Jordan Pavlin, emailed Rebecca and was like, don't sell this book to anyone else. So it was like, is this the wrong book to publish? Am I making a huge mistake? But this person wants it. So yeah, it was sort of mingled terror and joy.
I suppose it just shows you the subjective nature of it, though, and that nobody really knows anything. And
very much so. Yeah, taste is taste, and taste is powerful, which is extremely difficult to make peace with as a writer. You sort of want everyone to love your
work. Yeah, of course. But... And you're kind of ploughing your own furrow. So, you mentioned obviously you got the feedback, that initial feedback when you first started working with your agent, and you had these long, critical conversations and things. So when you first handed over your first baby, if you like, your first novel that you think, right, this is the one, this is a novel, you've kind of moved on from writing short stories and this is my novel, and then you get all this feedback. Do you remember how that felt initially? Were you kind of initially, did you resist it slightly? Were you a bit, I mean, obviously you'd been through your education, you'd obviously had workshops and you'd worked through things, but how did it feel when you had your novel and you were getting this kind of feedback?
Well, it's definitely daunting. Getting feedback on short stories, you're dealing with something that's, maybe 20, maybe 30 pages long. And so if you need to change something, there's only so far the ripple effect can go. Whereas editing a novel, you change something at the beginning and it ripples through 400 pages or more.
Yeah.
And so it sort of can feel a little bit like a house of cards. And so you can be sort of protective of elements of it purely to avoid doing the work of fixing it.
Just because you know how much work's going to be involved.
Right. Like, no, I don't want to do that. But I do think this was true of workshopping short stories and has been true of all my novels. Often when I'm writing, there's some alarm going off in my head that says, this whatever you're doing right now isn't really working.
Mm-hmm.
And I often will ignore that and be like, no, I'm sure it is. I'm sure other people will think it's working. And this is just me.
Then you get found out.
Right. It's inevitably, that's like, oh, that's not working. And there's a sense of, oh, I know. I was just hoping it would.
I thought that might sneak past. Yeah. But I suppose there's a huge amount of satisfaction when you get to the other side of the process, and that thing that was a little niggle and you thought, well, I know that that's not quite right. It's now, you found a better way of doing it, or you've kind of resolved the issue.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes in those conversations, an idea will come to me. And so it can be sort of exciting going like, oh, okay, now I know what to do. And my agent will sometimes make suggestions and I'm always like, oh no, but maybe this other thing, and then just an example from Great Circle was in all the way through to when we sold it, I had this plot element where Marion's twin brother went to live in this community of in a religious community in Canada. They're called Doukhobors, and they came from Russia in the late 19th century, and they're pacifists and they live communally. They're sort of like Russian Quakers, and they're super interesting. But it was, as my editor put it was just one weird thing too many.
You've over-weirded the pudding, yeah.
Right. We've tipped over the edge of acceptable weirdness. And so that was one of those things where I kind of knew. And my agent had been like, I don't know, let's see what Jordan says. And sure enough. But then I had to not only take out all those pages, but then fill in new page, write probably 50 new pages to give him something else to do. And
right.
It was a big job. So
it's just, as you say, it's the work that's always there, that you've got to go back and do the extra work. So how, when you're writing, how do you fit your novel writing around real life plus all the other, you mentioned that you've been doing travel writing in different bits and pieces, so how do you fit the novel writing, the actual work that you want to get done, how do you fit it around all the rest of the stuff?
Well, it can be difficult. I have it really easy. I'm not married. I don't have children. This supports me, so I don't have another job. I think the truly impressive people are all my friends who teach and have children and
Yeah.
write novels.
Yeah.
And will get up at 5 a.m. I don't have to do any of that. I have to sort of wrangle all this free time. So when I'm really working, I'll often work every day. When I was younger, I worked at night a lot. Now I tend to work not in the early morning, but through sort of the first half of the day. And I would sort of, before the pandemic, like lure myself out. I'll be like, you can go get coffee, but you have to take your laptop and you have to stay there for 3 hours
Yeah.
and do work. So it can be pretty steady. I write pretty quickly. This was why Great Circle was a bit of a shock to me. As my first book, I wrote the first draft, as I said, in 8 months. My second book, I wrote the draft that we sold in 5 months. And so I was emotionally unprepared for 3 years. And then the travel has been a complicating factor, but because Great Circle has such a range of settings, and particularly during Marion's flight in the polar regions, I really wanted to get to the Arctic and Antarctic, which I did during the period I was writing, but that would usually just make it impossible to write for whatever that period was, though sometimes I tried.
And when it sounds like it's quite important for you to kind of get some kind of experience of the places that you're writing about as much as possible. I know that's not always possible, but when you sit down to write a scene, or you're laying out a scene or a new location for the first time, have you kind of got are there set things that you tend to think about? Have you got like a set approach? Some people talk about the five senses and different bits and pieces, or how do you put yourself in that world for the first time and start sort of drawing it out for yourself?
I don't really know. Some of it's just instinct. Like if I'm starting from the very beginning of a book, I like to have, a first line, which serves the purpose also of establishing a voice. And of course, there are a lot of technical decisions in a first line, like first person, third person, past tense, present tense, whatever. Yeah. And I find to get anything going, I often need sort of two elements, and it could be kind of a voice in a setting, or a character and a plot point, or two characters, different sort of iterations like that have some overlap. And then when I'm in the middle of something, I can sort of feel, I guess, as I'm ending one section and establishing another, I think there needs to be a pretty strong distinction. So I think I'm sort of thinking about how to draw that line and sort of as efficiently as possible situate the reader in the new piece. But yeah, I don't know. I think some of it's just kind of gut level for me.
It's just instinctual, something that you've honed over time.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say drives you to write in general?
Financial necessity. That is actually partly true. I think if I taught, I don't know if I would be able to summon the discipline. And it was scary writing Great Circle, especially as it came closer to being time to sell it. And I'd kind of been running through my savings. And it was, again, that moment where I was like, well, this might not sell. This was a huge gamble to put 4 years into one project, and ultimately 7 years between the two publications. But I think when I'm in the book, I'm driven by curiosity. All my books are about different sort of distinct, I would have said subcultures for my first two books, with the first one being sort of waspy New Englanders having a wedding. The second book was about ballet. This book's much more expansive about a lot of different things. But I've chosen sort of worlds that aren't my world, but that I'm very interested in, and that's really essential to me. And kind of keeps me going, just being interested in the questions that I'm raising rather than trying to express any answers, and in the characters themselves, I suppose.
Well, you're obviously very driven with that story, as you say, to spend such a long time on it and kind of invest that amount of time and effort into it. So, that's great to see. What would you say, from your time in education, you mentioned about Zadie Smith coming in and various other different things. What would you say is the most common mistake that new writers make in your experience? And that might be partly the mistakes that you've made, but that you've seen other people make.
I think as much as possible, it's helpful to take ego out of your writing. I think like any piece of fiction I've read that's more of a posture on the part of the writer, like wanting to write something I don't know, cool, or just that isn't driven by something more deeply rooted than the style of it, or
Sure.
I think I've said to students before, think about how when you're literally telling a story out loud, like sharing a piece of gossip with friends, the way you tell it, with that sort of urgency or playfulness or seriousness, whatever. I mean, that I think is what ideally you bring to the page too. You are telling people something, and so it should be moving away from you, as opposed to being about you or you as a writer. And I think actually one of my advantages coming to Iowa is that even when I went, I wasn't sure I wanted to be a writer, and it hadn't been this dream since childhood. I didn't have sort of visions of myself as the typewriter. And I think ultimately that was very helpful. I think sometimes that attachment to the idea of writing can be paralyzing for people.
The romance of it, sort of thing.
Exactly.
Rather than the actual real life version of it, which is a lot of hard work and application.
Yeah. And, entertainment, like it has to touch other people.
Uh-huh.
So we have to have a sense of what people are taking from it.
And if you want to go down the traditional publishing route, then it has to have some kind of commercial value, or not value is probably not the right word, but it has to have something that will potentially be commercial that other people want to buy into from that point of view as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people who work in publishing are genuinely passionate about books and literature and are in many cases unafraid to take some risks and to bring in new voices and try things that are different. But it is also true that it's a business, and people, I think that I get asked a lot, do you have to have an MFA? Do you have to be an insider? And no, I think if anything, editors and agents are interested in people with different sorts of stories and trajectories than just, yet another person sort of churned out by creative writing workshops. But at the same time, sometimes those workshops are really helpful to start getting a sense of how other people perceive your writing, which people writing in a vacuum often don't quite have. And so, I just don't think of their work in the context of what is out there and what's selling and what editors are buying, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. What would you say has been the most helpful piece of creative or inspirational advice that you've been given along the way, would you say? Is there anything that kind of sticks out for you? And that might be writing related or otherwise.
I mean, I kind of touched on this, but when I was at Stanford, one of my teachers, a writer named Elizabeth Talent, told our workshop to just think about what's the most interesting thing that could happen next in your fiction and do that and follow the interest. And that doesn't mean, have it start raining purple dinosaurs, because that's too arbitrary to actually be interesting. But that's what I think of. That's the piece of writing advice I think of the most. And it's funny because I just did a Zoom bookstore event with a friend of mine who was in that same workshop and just has a new book out called The 5 Wounds. And somebody asked her the same question, and she cited the same piece of advice. And it seems so simple, and yet it's clearly stuck with more people than just myself.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a similar thing if you ever do like those writing exercises where they'll give you a word or they'll give you a sentence or something, and you kind of go off that and you write a piece of flash fiction or whatever it is. And often, one of the best pieces of advice I was always given is, the first 10 ideas that you come up with, discard all 10 of them, and it's the 11th one that's when you should start to think about it. And it's I'm not, it's not quite that arbitrary, but to think about it like that because what you tend to find is those first 10 things or 5 things or whatever number you decide on are the most obvious ones, are the least interesting, are the things that probably lots of other people would have thought about and have been done to death and everything else. So it is kind of pushing through the obvious things, isn't it?
Yeah, or approaching them differently. Like, I'm in some ways kind of interested in cliche as a thing, not really cliched language, but tropes that are sort of familiar to us. And like in Great Circle with the Hollywood character, there are elements to there's sort of like a Me Too moment, for example, which I think was in there before the Weinstein story broke.
Mm-hmm.
But in some ways, the Harvey Weinstein story wasn't a surprise to anyone, because we've had, casting couch jokes forever.
Like course,
there's this underlying truth to it. So I think sometimes too, I like to take the familiar and try to play with it. And that could be in terms of style or in the way it spins out, plot wise. But yeah, I think freshness can be done with things that are familiar, and then I think things that are fresh can sometimes seem arbitrarily quirky and annoying. So it's just, it can always go wrong, it can always go right.
Absolutely. So as we kind of move towards wrapping things up, if you were starting again tomorrow as a brand new writer, what, if anything, would you do differently, or what would you go back and tell your younger self, do you think?
Oh, what a
Run
terrible
away.
thought.
Teach.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I always think the most important thing is to read. So I think I read a lot as a child. I've always read a lot. I think I would probably read even more. I think I've become quite patient, but I wasn't always. I think I wish I could tell my first self to be patient. It's really a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah.
Both, writing career in general and every sort of piece of it. Yeah, I think those are big ones. And also I think writing Great Circle has been really, so my first 2 books were published 2 years apart. So quite, back to back.
Yeah.
And so when it started to become apparent that Great Circle was going to take me a long time to write, part of my panicked feeling was, oh no, everyone will forget about me. Like I'm, out of the literary world, but everyone forgets about you 2 weeks after your book comes out. It does
2 days.
And having my life be about other things, I think made me a better writer and made me probably a more relaxed writer. And I think a more content person. So I think just, telling myself to chill out a little bit would
relax a little bit. Because I suppose as well, for anybody that hasn't been in publishing or they're getting published for the first time or whatever, I'm talking specifically about traditional publishing. Obviously, indie's a bit different, but traditional publishing is the timescales involved anyway often really surprise people. They just assume if your book gets picked up or somebody buys it, then, oh, great, it's probably going to be in the shops in a few months or a couple of months or whatever. And as you kind of mentioned earlier, it's often 18 months, 2 years or whatever, depending on what the publishing schedule and of who you're with or whatever. So I guess that takes a big adjustment as well when you first get started.
Yeah, it's really been a lesson in the fact that time actually passes. Like Seating Arrangements was 2 years. Astonish Me was almost 2 years, and Great Circle, between selling it and publication, is 2 years, 8 months, which I would have been, I didn't know it would be quite that long. I thought maybe we'd get in under 2 years. I would have been completely horrified But I needed that time to do edits. And then in the lead up to publication, a lot of people have been doing a lot of work for the book. And because it's a longer book, it takes people time to read. And
Sure.
so the time has ended up being necessary and great. And here we are anyway, because time continues to pass.
It
So
does, yeah. It's got a habit
yeah.
of doing that.
And I don't think anyone ever says, oh, I wish I'd published that sooner. Like, I wish I'd done less work on it.
Yeah,
You
sure.
can't help but kind of look back and be like, oh, I wish I'd changed that one thing.
So as we kind of wrap things up then, can you give us maybe a hint of what might be up next or what's bubbling away for you? And also tell people where they can find out more about you, find out about you online and follow you on social media, etc.
Sure. I will start with that just so I don't forget. You can go to my website, which is just my name. So it's www.maggieshipstead.com. And I have a lot of my travel writings up there, some information about the books, events, all these things. I don't use Facebook, but I'm on Instagram at Shipstead. So I have a collection of short stories, which is coming out next summer in the US, and I believe probably also same timing in the UK, although I'm not sure. I sold that with Great Circle.
That's great.
So yeah, and it's kind of stories from over a long period of writing and publishing them. And then I have started working on a new novel, which I plan for it to be somewhat less ambitious.
But we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. And yeah, just getting going on that, but obviously not writing very much right now at all.
Well, you've got lots to go on and all the promo for this book anyway to worry about.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for coming on Joined Up Writing, but for now, thanks a million. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Wayne.
Joined up writing.
There you go. Thanks again to Maggie Shipstead, and I'll put all of her links in the show notes over at joinedupwriting.co.uk. That's pretty much it for this week, but don't forget to get in touch with all your thoughts on the show, feedback, and to tell me what's going on in your writing world. And you can do that by dropping me an email at wayne@waynekellyWrites.com. Also, remember you can find the entire back catalogue of interviews on the website. Make sure you subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Overcast, YouTube, or wherever else you get your podcasts from. And then you can have the podcast downloaded automatically every time an episode pops up. Also, remember to leave us a nice rating and review on Apple Podcasts because it really does help others to find the show. Or, just tell one of your mates. That'd be great as well. So that's it for this week. Thanks for listening. I'm Wayne Kelly. Happy writing, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.